high confidence level. I don't sense any panic. There's no finger pointing, which I've heard has gone on in the other camp. And so I think the feeling is really good, but this is a very close election. So all the confidence in the world doesn't necessarily mean you'll win. It's a huge factor. I mean, if you look at what the Democrats were able to do in 2020 and also in the midterms in 2022, they really beat the Republicans at getting out the vote, at ballot harvesting, which has only been legal since 2020. So they just got to jump on it. And Republicans have been playing catch up now for 4 years. I think this time around, even if we didn't catch up completely, I still think the Democrats could arguably have a better ground game and a better ballot harvesting machine. But the margin is so much different this year. The Republicans have actually caught up with early voting in 5 out of the 7 swing states. So actually more Republicans voted early, both mail-in and early voting at the polls. We still lag in 2 swing states, but we lag by a lot less than we did 4 years ago. So that metric is important, and I don't doubt the Democrats are going to be getting people to the polls today, but they're going to have to get a lot more people to the polls physically today than they did in 2020 because they're lagging in terms of the mail-in and early voting. I mean, I think the 2 most obvious ones are African Americans and Hispanics, and Kamala Harris is lagging in both of those identity groups by 15 to 25 points versus where Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Hillary Clinton were. So that's a big problem for the Democrats. They can't win without that coalition. And, they might make up some of that with, the so-called suburban women or especially single women. So they'll win. They'll probably lose single men, married men, and most likely lose married women. They typically do. But the question is, what is the margin that they win single women? And that could make up for some of the loss in the minority groups. But, look, the Democrat hasn't won a white majority since LBJ in 1964. They are completely dependent on the demographic group. So if we don't see some recovery for Kamala in those groups, it could be trouble for her. Yeah, I mean, I'm much more confident now than I was in 2020. And there were a lot of irregularities, not obvious fraud where you have a picture or a photograph of someone stuffing ballots or something. It's more sophisticated. And they loosened the laws pretty dramatically in 2020 prior to the election. And that made it difficult for the Republicans to monitor and to play catch up. This year, I think there'll be a lot more confidence in Pennsylvania. There's been a couple of mishaps already. There's been some incidents that show the exposure that Pennsylvania has to irregularities, but a lot less than 2020. And the Republicans just got ahead of it this time. We've got thousands of lawyers on the ground, so they've been much more proactive, much more preemptive. So I think you'll see a more secure. I can't say it will be perfect, and we've already seen some incidents, but I think we just are a little more proactive this time.
If I lose an election, if it's a fair election, I'd be the first one to acknowledge it. And I think so far, I think it's been fair. I think there's been a lot of court cases. Both sides are lawyered up.
I think they'll be very conscious of any type of irregularities, right? We saw some of that in 2020. The most important thing they did this time around was ahead of time. That doesn't mean that there's before, during, and after, and that doesn't mean that after is not important. We will have, I'm sure there'll be some challenges, I'm sure there'll be some recounts, and that's fine, but I do think we're all in a much better condition right now. The preemptive nature, part of it was just making sure there was no, or I should say less censorship. What really swung the election in 2020 was the censorship of the New York Post and the Hunter Biden laptop. The campaign actually colluded with the FBI and the social media companies. That's really what set us back. 2/3 of the voters did not know about the laptop and the Biden family business and the payments from China and Russia and Ukraine. And so that was a real miss for the Republicans because we weren't ahead of the game and we couldn't fight the censorship. It's different now. They were much more proactive. I mean, Elon Musk buying Twitter was a big help because he's made sure there's no censorship. And so I think this time around we've avoided that one. I mean, there's still been a little bit. We didn't hear much about some of the October surprises about Kamala Harris, about her husband, about the potential domestic violence issues, totally buried by the mainstream media, but not buried by the social media.
I don't have to tell them that there'll be no violence. Of course there'll be no violence. My supporters are not violent people. I don't have to tell them that. And I certainly don't want any violence, but I certainly don't have to tell. These are great people. These are people that believe in no violence. Unlike your question, you believe in violence. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think we'll see that. And there's a few reasons for that. One, I've already mentioned, the Republicans have been much more proactive. So if there are complaints and there are challenges, those will just be met with the procedures in place, with the institutions that are in place. So, it doesn't mean there won't be any. And I think mail-in voting makes the elections really vulnerable. And the Democrats are really good at ballot harvesting, but that ballot harvesting means you send thousands of ballots to buildings, apartment buildings, especially government housing or public housing, and then you go to those buildings and collect the ballots. They do it with care homes as well. So it really opens up opportunity to over mail ballots, right? So 3 people at a care home request ballots, you send 20. And then you go back and collect the 20. And maybe you suggest to someone, you haven't voted in 4 years, or you haven't voted in 4 cycles, would you like to vote this time? It's legal, but it's vulnerable to to either fraud or at least to voting irregularities. So we're trying to be really careful about that. And again, much more proactive this time. Biggest one's inflation, no doubt about it. Because people might not miss Donald Trump, but they miss peace and prosperity of his term. So, since his term, since Biden took office, real wages are down 3.5% for American workers. And that's really troubling in a country like America, where wages not always keep up with inflation, but most of the time they do. And wages were up 8% in the Trump years. In 2019 alone, they were up 6.8%. So, that's what people miss, is prosperity. I think the border crisis is another one that they'll look back on as an own goal for the Democrats. The border was relatively secure when they took over, and they opened it up to 10 million illegal migrants. Americans just don't want to tolerate that anymore, and it's caused a lot of problems. And the Democrats, I hope, look back at that and say, big mistake. The inflation was a big mistake. They caused it. The border was a big mistake. They caused that, but they did it on purpose, which is really troubling. That's really what's going to swing the election, those 2 things.